Haidong! In this video, we're going to talk about Bankuk 1. Now, because the three concepts I want to talk about with Bankuk 1 are all fundamental, I do want to talk about each of them a little bit more in detail, right? So the first one is going to be our Paosongse, right? Or the Paosongse defense, right? So what I'm going to do is actually, instead of having like one really long video that no one ever wants to sit down and watch the whole thing, what I'm going to do is actually split this up a little bit, right? So the first one is going to be talking about just the concept of Paosongse, and the other two, I guess just to kind of give you a sneak preview, is going to be a different kind of synchrony that's used in the Bankuk, right? And the other one that I'm going to talk about is how you, this is going to be super vague, but how you engage your body differently with the form. I know that sounds really vague. It's not going to make sense until you're like, oh, like that's literal. But, so I'm going to split this one up into two just because I'd rather not give anyone anxiety looking at super long videos like, I'm working on Bankuk, I must learn. So at least give you at least a way to kind of like separate those two. So this is going to be part one specifically of Bankuk 1. Bankuk is going to be the last set of forms I'm going to talk about on this channel. Again, talking about aspects of it, talking about, things that a judge might be looking for, things that are new as you go through this form, that kind of thing. And again, I'm going to be ending after Bankuk just because, first of all, I haven't been taught all of Genbaek, which is the next set of forms, and that's going to be very exciting. And also, again, the Federation kind of likes to have anything beyond Bankuk kind of like hush-hush. So, we're going to be doing some Bankuk. Now, if you've done Bankuk before, you already know it's a very distinct style compared to the Sangsu and the Yedo, right? So Yedo, again, according to my pet theory, is going to be a lot more, one-handed, is a lot more sword-driven first, and then you're going to be coming around with the rest of the body. Sangsu is going to be allegedly using a Sangsu gum, which is a particularly long sword, and it's going to be a lot more, again, to use the Japanese term, kikentai ichi is going to be a lot more one-to-one, right? So again, the sword motion is going to be matching the body motion pretty, like when I prepare my stance, I prepare my cut, that kind of synchrony. Bankuk is going to be very different. Bankuk is going to be closer to the synchrony that we see in Teidose, right? So when we do our switch cuts in Teidose, we do have synchrony, right? We don't have that step, draw back, but we do still have something. So let's get started with Bankuk 1. The first thing that I would like to talk about is the actual draw, right? So the actual draw is actually not that big of a deal, right? You're drawing down, like I'm getting your distance, nice and smooth, all that fun stuff. But our first guard that we're going to use, if you don't count, again, a one-hand low guard, is going to be our left Paosongse. Now, this has a lot of different potential interpretations, potential versions of it. So I'm going to go through more or less three major ones to think about and identify like what is useful about each of them. Of the three versions we're going to be talking about, two of them I have learned from a Gumdo instructor, or at least I've seen in the Federation canon. The other one is going to be something that I've seen in historical manuscripts. This one, to be more specific. The first version is going to be the one that we've seen a lot more in our basics. Again, I talked about this with our Paosongse video, but we actually do have both our right Paosongse in basics. Again, this is usually associated with Gongai Dongyep. We also have our left side basic, or left side Paosongse, right? So we're here, and as we're going into our Chiase, we're going to drop into our left Paosongse and drop down into our low guard. So noticing, right, so this is our left Paosongse, the blade is facing outward. So as opposed to Paosongse, where the right Paosongse, where the blade is drawing forward, almost again like I'm honing an arrow, this one is across, and again about the same height. Now notice this is actually, so this version of it is still relatively close. Again, Paosongse is pretty close. This side is also going to be relatively close. And it's just, again, it's a nice guard, right? Just like presenting the weapon really more than anything else, right? So this is going to be one version of it. So let's actually go through the three versions and talk about the pros and cons of each. The second version is pretty much the first one, but it's a lot more forward, right? So for example, the one we just talked about is about here, the other one I've seen is a lot more presenting this way. So notice I'm almost making, if I kind of like look from above, almost like making a square with, again, each of my, like my elbows, each of the corners, and then my sword and shoulder being the other two. So this is going to be a lot more like present arms kind of idea here, right? I know it doesn't really look that much different from the front, but yeah, so having this out is again presenting a weapon. Again, if it is a heavier weapon, this actually might not be the easiest way to deal with it because this is only using, again, those smaller muscles. But again, this is a little bit more perhaps formal, and perhaps this is also good for, again, blocking on that 45. But let's talk about our third option and then talk about, again, the good and the bad. The third option, again, this is the one that came from the other manuscript, is actually the version that I like, which is probably going to get me in trouble, but I like this version. So it's going to be, again, so this is our normal version 1, right? Kind of like do a nice slow spin to give you guys an idea. So if this is the normal version in number 1, all you're going to do is going to be a little bit lower, right? So the hand is going to be a little bit lower than the other one. So the other two have been pretty much up here. This is a little bit lower. And you're literally just going to rest the sword against your side. So this is obviously going to be a lot easier to move, like just have with you, right? So I can hold this position more or less indefinitely, right? This costs very little, if anything, to hold it. Obviously there's some because energy is not free, but this is very easy for me just to kind of advance. So having like a nice, ready position and it's just kind of relaxed. So let's talk about those pros and cons. So version 1, again, that's the one that's relatively close, but still about jaw level. This is nice if I'm trying to deflect, right? So if I see a cut coming in, I can match it and then come in towards the opponent, right? So again, from the side. If I'm just here, again, it's still, like I'm still obviously ready for combat. Someone's coming in, I can slide in with that cut, right? Or I can slide in with the block. It's very easy to generally, just from here, be able to snap out in the direction that I need to. I can twist the blade according to, again, if I want to absorb some of their momentum. It's just generally a nice fighting guard. There's nothing particularly, I would say nothing particularly bad. So like there's no obvious drawback aside from the fact that it's just kind of across your body. So like this isn't as suitable for attack, right? This one is. This one I'm like, especially if I have this version of the Pao Sung-se, right? This one, I just snap out and you're not happy. This one, you can still do the same thing, right? But it's not going to be as powerful. But that said, if I know I have to deflect this side, it's easy for me to come in. And if someone's coming this way, like it's not impossible for me to kind of like evade back and push. So it's still a decent guard. So that guard was mostly again, jack of all trades, really master of none. Again, the rest of the saying is actually better, but that's okay. But if we just take the first half of that saying, so here, like, okay, like it's not great at any one particular thing, but it's pretty well balanced, right? So again, if someone's being sassy with me, trying to dispatch me, I can like draw back with a block, I can twist into a block, I can do okay cuts from this, I can do some weird stuff if I really need to. It's okay, but it's not going to be like a very specialized guard. So for example, like high guard up here is really specialized for that single strike that I want, right? Like this is not good for defense, but it's really good for offense. And likewise, something like this or like this is going to be a lot better for defense. Maybe not this one so much, but like having something like here is going to be a lot better for a defensive position as opposed to here. It's pretty much the middle guard, just a little bit closer, right, closer to your chest. So it's okay, but again, it's well-rounded. But comparing that with our other one, so version 2, where it's just more out, this definitely has, again, the formality to it. But this, unfortunately, doesn't have that much power or that much going for it in general, right? So if I'm trying to attack you with this, I will need to draw back in to do something, right? So if I'm here, I can do like like something like that, or maybe a block of some sort. Like this, first of all, like because my wrist is no longer close to my chest, is now reaching forward, it's not protecting me anymore, right? So this is our normal guard. We usually do this to protect our wrists. Same thing for both sides, right? But if I'm just doing this, I'm, again, just presenting a position. right? It's like, all right, like, oh, hit my wrist. And then they probably will, because you can't really deflect it that well from here. So that is a major downside for this one in particular. Again, the formality to it, again, it has nice lines, right? So from an aesthetic perspective, cool. If I want to take this from maybe a different perspective and say like, oh, this is good for like developing, good muscles or something like that, holding this, because it's activating pretty much all the small muscles and not that many of the deep ones, this will, if you're holding a really, really heavy weapon for a really long time, would tone a little bit. But from from a sparring or fighting perspective, this one is meh, right? So that said, to kind of like, put my foot in my mouth, this one is the most common of those who practice Bankuk. This is the most common of the guards, so I just attacked that, so huzzah. Right, I'm going to get in trouble, but let's play with that. Versus our third option. For those of you who have been practicing Gumdo for, again, probably a decade plus, you might actually recognize that defense as not something that we've done in Basic, which is a relatively new addition as far as I know. We've actually done this in Sangsu. So, in fact, Sangsu 11. So if you remember, back in the day, right, so after our second crosscut, we would bounce back into this. Now, I learned this as the Emperor's Walk. I don't know if that's even vaguely canonical. But this one, right, so it's 1, 2, and then 1, 2, 3. I'm trying to stay in frame. So this, potentially, was in an older version. That said, just so you can kind of keep this in mind as well, so this is no longer canonical with Sangsu 11. The left wing, right, because the tip is on the left, and this is a wing apparently, left wing. This is now the new canonical 10, or 11. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, right? Versus the original, as far as I know, original left Haosungse. But that said, so aside from this potentially being something you've seen in the past, I really like this guard. So especially when I'm teaching, I do like to have this guard, which is probably rude of me. But this, so for one, again, a pro, you can hold this position indefinitely, right? There's nothing strenuous about this, right? Again, most of the weight is, again, on your hand, on your shoulder. It's just easy. And especially if your blade is not like super long, it's not going to be a problem, right? And also, this particular guard is really good for the next move every single time for the Bankuk. So for example, with our first form, it's here, the next move is a left Diagon Cut. All you need to do is slide it back and cut. Very easy, right? So again, from here, all I need to do, again, even maintain contact if I want to, again, probably have the blade out a little bit just so it's not like rubbing up. Here, just slide back, cut. Super easy. Now that said, that also works pretty well with at least the first version as well. If it's here, back, cut. Pretty easy. Two Nasum, again, the most canonical, here, not as much. So this, the resting position, is super good for pretty much all of the draws that we do, at least in Bankuk, right? So again, number 1, pop. Number 2, pop. Number 3, pop. Same thing, again, over and over and over. This is always going to be a good position for you, at least in terms of the next move in the form, which makes me think this is also going to be potentially something that is probably canonical back in the day, maybe not canonical, but probably one of the original derivations. Now, if you've done other sword martial arts, the fact that you can make contact while you're moving around is going to strike you as like, oh, that's sort of like Chinese, Dao, for example. So here, like kind of rolling and slicing, right? So again, that rolling, again, making contact kind of motion is very much something that you've seen in a lot of Chinese swordsmanship, right? And what is Bankuk? Bankuk is Old Kingdom style, which is super vague, super vague. Again, referring back to that brown book that I showed in the beginning of the video, there's at least a couple different theories about what type of sword you're even using. You might be using a curved sword, but according to that book, it might also be a straight sword. But that said, I've tried going through these forums with a John, right, so a Chinese straight sword. It doesn't really work. So versus, it probably is going to be using something like this, again, like a jingum, that kind of style of sword. So, so we are practicing with the right thing. So we can still use, that kind of resting period to strike. So that's just a nice kind of more cultural thing to kind of just keep in mind, because that just keeps perspective, right? But I didn't talk about cons, did I? So I definitely had a lot more cons for the others, so I have to have something against my favorite, right? Well, let's take a few ideas, right? So you might think initially, like, well, this is bad for defense, right? Like, you can't defend from this. And it's like, I can actually use, again, my shoulder to actually push off into a pretty decent block. Same thing with an attack, right? So from here, again, we do it with the form, but also from here, if I just want to strike you, all I need to do is flex. Again, everything's already back. You can just flex forward and strike. Now, that said, your blade angle will not probably work until the very end, but you can still snap a strike out. So I guess I'll count that as a con because I need something. Yeah, so this general guard is actually a pretty all-around decent one. Again, this is more intact or more intended probably for offense than defense. So for example, again, if any of my students are watching this, you know that I like to fight from this one, which is very similar, right? So these are very similar, right? I like to fight from this guard. This is just the other side. So anyway, so those are the three variations of the Paosengse guard. Now, because this was a little bit more thematic, and we were talking about a new guard, although I did do a video on Paosengse, this is a little more in-depth about three variations of it just in the beginning of this form. With regard specifically to, again, what we're doing with Bankuk, what I'd like for you to do is also have some drills, right? So one drill I would like for you to do is try sparring with all three. Now, if you're not really that much of a sparring school, or if your students are fairly new or anything like that, probably do it a little bit differently, right? But all I want you to do is all right, assuming, at this point I'm assuming you are, high enough rank because you're watching a Bankuk video. So if you haven't learned Bankuk, shame. You shouldn't be watching this video until you've learned it from a Federation master. So I'm assuming you have. I'm watching you if you haven't. But, so what I'd like you to do is all right, so you bow into your fighting, and it's all right, let me just try, Federation number 1, right? Okay, all right, let me try to attack, my opponent. Let me try to strike. Okay, that's weird. Let me try to stab. Let's move, right? Now, what's nice about this is you can be very mobile with this, right? You can be in walking stance. You can be in shifting potato say if you need to, right? You can kind of move around. But try from here. Try again the presentation. Try to make this work because this is the Federation's favorite. So try to make this work. Do the best of your ability. That said, just like with your first taste, try fighting in this guard and try not to get addicted to it, because once you do, it's a gateway. It's a gateway to forever sparring like this or like this, right? So that way. So give this, the good college try, as they say, and then try again version 1, version 3, and just kind of see how you feel with it, right? Now, this might be a little bit strange if you're using safety swords because they're curved, and it's kind of difficult to kind of get the sensation of the blade angle. So if you do have something that is more chiseled, so maybe like a mukam or like one of these swords I have over here that I'm going to bring up in a second, I would recommend using something that has both a curve, right, as well as an actual edge per se. Totally not sponsored, but if you want to sponsor me, that'd be awesome. But Purple Heart Armory has these very, very, very lovely, pretty much indestructible as far as I know, but that's my word, not theirs, so be careful. But these guys, which are really nice for sparring, they are hardened plastic, so make sure you have really good protection if you do any actual striking against someone. But these are absolutely wonderful for light sparring and all that fun stuff. So highly recommend. They're great products. Huzzah. Sponsor me. Now that I've annoyed every Federation person because I want sponsorship from a non-Federation source, what I'd like for you to also try is go practice these guards again with different blades. Now, one thing that I mentioned, and just because it was kind of an off shot, right? Also try going through your Bankuk with a curved sword and a straight one. Now, I've tried with a straight sword. I failed miserably at it. I feel generally that it just didn't work. I could be doing things weirdly. So try it with, again, the curved sword, try it with the straight sword, try with the heavy sword, try with a light sword, try with a one-handed sword. Also is really weird with Bankuk, but whatever. But go ahead, right? So that will make more sense with our next video where we're talking about, again, how we're talking about the synchrony and just how your body moves in Bankuk in a very different fashion. So I love this guard so much, I'm still in it. So with that, right? So make sure you keep training, stay safe, and stay humble, and give these guards a try. Haidong!